Young adults today are much less likely than their elders to associate with a religion. And in fact, they're much more likely than any previous generation of young people has been, at least in recent decades. In fact, today about 1/3 of all American adults under the age of 30 describe themselves as either atheists or agnostics, or say they just don't have any particular religion. And that large number is a big part of what's driving the overall growth in this population. If we look back historically, we have not tended to see that people become more religiously affiliated as they get older, as their generation ages. And so while it's certainly impossible to predict the future, we can't know for sure what's going to happen with young people today or with any other generation. The history, the past certainly suggests that if this generation follows historical trends, they may not become more likely to say they're religiously affiliated in any appreciable numbers. The religiously unaffiliated population is not wholly secular. It would be wrong to think of them as consisting entirely of non-believers, for example. We know that many, if not most of them, say they do believe in God. They do describe themselves as spiritual. They are engaged in religion. They do have religious beliefs in that sense. At the same time, we don't find much evidence to suggest that the religiously unaffiliated are seekers in any, at least not in any disproportionate sense. You know, we asked people, for example, whether or not they are just looking for a religion that's right for them, and we find very few people who say that they are. We also don't find much evidence to suggest that the religiously unaffiliated are engaged in New Age practices or Eastern religious beliefs and practices, at least not at rates any higher than we see among the general public. So while on the one hand it would be a mistake to think of the religiously unaffiliated as wholly secular, it would also be a mistake to think of them as consisting entirely of people who are just seeking out a new path or practicing alternative forms of religion. The religiously unaffiliated population is certainly much younger than the population as a whole. It's interesting, it's also more heavily comprised of males, of men, than is the population as a whole, and that's particularly true of atheists and agnostics. In terms of their educational background, their socioeconomic status, the unaffiliated as a whole, which includes atheists and agnostics, but it also includes a large number of people who say their religion is nothing in particular. The religiously unaffiliated as a whole tends to resemble the general public in terms of their education, their educational background, their income, but atheists and agnostics tend to fall very high on that socioeconomic ladder. They are very well educated. They have higher levels of educational attainment than the public as a whole. So while there are some defining characteristics of this group, it's also true that we have seen growth among the unaffiliated across a wide variety of categories. So in recent years, both men and women, people from all kinds of educational backgrounds, people from across the country have increasingly been describing themselves as religiously unaffiliated. The religiously unaffiliated do tend to express negative views of religion, of organized religion. They tend to be much more likely than the public as a whole, for example, to say that religion and religious organizations are too focused on rules, too concerned with things like money and power, too focused on politics. So they do ascribe these kind of negative attributes to religious organizations at very high levels. At the same time, they also see they also say that religion does make certain positive contributions. For example, they say that religious organizations are effective in providing help to the poor and to the needy. They say religious organizations do a good job of helping bring communities together. So it's sort of an ambivalent view. On the one hand, they do say that there are negative characteristics associated with organized religion. At the same time, many of them also see some beneficial aspects of religion in American society. Nearly all of the increase in in the numbers who say that they are religiously unaffiliated occurs among people who seldom or never attend religious services. And that suggests to me that part of what's going on is that people are increasingly describing their own religious affiliation in terms that more closely match their own level of religious practice and involvement, at least as measured by frequency of religious attendance. As recently as 2007, just 5 years ago, most people who told us they seldom or never attend religious services nevertheless told us that they associated with one religious group or another. They were Protestants or Catholics or Jews. In 2012, only about half of everyone who seldom or never attends services is still affiliated. So there's been a 10-point drop in self-described religious affiliation among people who seldom or never attend religious services. So on the one hand, there are many measures of religious belief and engagement that have been pretty steady in recent years and even in recent decades. For example, we continue to find that the vast majority of Americans say that they believe in God. We continue to find large numbers saying that religion is a very important part of their lives. We continue to find that on measures like that, the United States really is considerably more religious than many other European countries, for example. At the same time, there are other measures that do suggest that the United States may gradually be becoming at least a little bit less religious. For example, the number of people who say they seldom or never attend religious services has ticked up by about 4 points over the last decade or so. And we've also seen over the last 25 years a small but noticeable decline in the number of people who say they believe in God and they never doubt that belief. So on those kinds of measures, there is some evidence of a gradual decline. Most Americans continue to describe themselves as religious. Some people say they're religious and not spiritual. Other people say they're religious and spiritual. But most people continue to say that they are religious. While the religiously unaffiliated population is growing, the ranks of American Protestantism are declining, at least in terms of their share of the U.S. population. Back in 2007, we were finding that 53% of American adults described themselves as Protestants. Today, that number has fallen to below 50%. In 2012, 48% of adults in our surveys describe themselves as Protestants. That is the first time in our data where we have seen the share of Protestants in the United States drop significantly below 50%. So this is kind of the flip side of the growth of the religiously unaffiliated, is the decline in American Protestantism. Now, we have looked a little deeper at the data, and what we see within Protestantism is that the declining share of adults who describe themselves as Protestants is concentrated primarily among whites. The share of the population that are black Protestants or Hispanic Protestants hasn't changed very much. But the share of the population that are white evangelical Protestants and people who describe themselves as non-evangelical Protestants, both of those groups have declined a little bit over the last 5 years or so. The growth in the religiously unaffiliated population, at least over the last few years, has been concentrated mostly among Democrats, for example. In fact, in our latest data in 2012, we're finding that about a quarter of all Democratic and Democratic-leaning registered voters describe themselves as religiously unaffiliated, and that's up significantly since just a few years ago. So there certainly is a partisan connection there. When we ask people about attributes that they would find attractive in a political candidate, for instance, being a non-believer consistently comes up as as a drawback. That is not a characteristic that many American voters look favorably upon. We also know that most people who are religiously unaffiliated were raised in a faith. In fact, about 3/4 of everyone who is religiously unaffiliated today says that when they were children, they were raised in a religion. They were either Protestants or Catholics or members of some other faith. So there is an element of change, of transition involved for most of this group. They are people who have become religiously unaffiliated after having been raised in a faith. There's a lot of things that go into trends in American religion, things like differential birth rates, fertility rates, differential mortality rates, conversion and retention of members. All these things make it very hard to predict the future. But certainly, I think it's safe to say that, that this group is, you know, a very important part of the American religious landscape. We do have one interesting question in the survey that might speak to this question of what keeps people away from church. We asked people who don't attend religious services very often, but who do say religion matters to them. We focused in on that group. These are people we focused in on people who say religion is at least somewhat important in their lives, but who said that they don't really attend religious services very often. We took a close look at that group and we asked them, why don't you attend religious services more often? We just asked them to tell us that in their own words. And what we found is that there's really a great variety of responses that we got. There are a lot of people who cite religious reasons for not attending religious services more often. They just don't believe in religion. There aren't any churches or religious organizations that reflect their own beliefs. There's a lot of that. But there are also a lot of people out there who tell us that they are unable to attend religious services because of practical difficulties. These include things like not having transportation to get there, health problems that keep them away, conflicts with other obligations, especially work was mentioned quite often. So there's a lot of people who don't attend church not because they don't believe, not because they don't want to, but because there are obstacles to them attending religious services. Our religious knowledge survey from a couple of years ago revealed that atheists and agnostics are among the most religiously knowledgeable people in the population. Atheists and agnostics are really pretty secular. They do, as the name implies, tend to be non-believers. But the largest group of the religiously unaffiliated population consists not of atheists or agnostics, but rather of people who describe their religion instead as just nothing in particular. That group is much less secular than atheists and agnostics in their outlook, in their religious beliefs and practices. They're much more likely to say they believe in God, for instance, to say they pray regularly. This is a group, the nothing in particular group, who really is not wholly secular. And it's also important to point out that, that the nothing in particular subgroup of the religiously unaffiliated does tend to be at least fairly religious. And on the flip side of that, you also have many people who are associated with religious groups, Protestants and Catholics and Jews, who are not particularly religious in terms of their level of involvement in congregations or the level of certainty with which they hold their religious beliefs. And there is evidence to suggest, not from our surveys, but from other research that scholars have done, that suggests that there is some appreciable movement back and forth between these two groups. That some of the people who describe their religion as nothing in particular sometimes nevertheless retain at least a marginal attachment to a religious tradition. And on the flip side, that sometimes people who have a marginal attachment to a religious affiliation aren't too far away from being in that nothing in particular category. So there is some movement back and forth across the margins there. If the patterns that we've seen for older generations, if the patterns that we've seen for baby boomers and the silent generation, if the patterns we've seen in the past hold true going forward, then there's not necessarily any reason to expect that millennials, for example, will be much more religiously affiliated 2, 3, 4 decades from now than they are today when we're first seeing them in our surveys.